So one of our recommendations is that the IRS could do this on its own, or Congress could explicitly authorize it to do so, that any independent news organization, and they can work out the regulations for what constitutes an independent news organization, devoted to reporting on public affairs, at least in part, could be created or converted into a 501c3 nonprofit, or something new that some states have created called a low profit liability corporation, in which case you can make some limited profit and still have some of the advantages of being a 501c3. If you've got questions about that, I'll give you my limited knowledge about it afterwards. It's our second recommendation, that philanthropists, foundations, and especially community foundations, every community in this country has at least one large community foundation in which families of various kinds have decided to leave money into a little family foundation of their own, or sometimes a big one, that adds up into a whole lot of family foundations in each community for local philanthropy. And by and large, this local philanthropy has been directed at museums and orchestras and the Boy Scouts and so on, but not at journalism. And a few have now stepped their toes in the water using it for journalism. So, for instance, the Voice of San Diego rents its offices from the San Diego Community Foundation, I assume at a good rent, and gets other kinds of direct support from the San Diego Community Foundation. There are a few other community foundations around the country that are beginning to support nonprofit news organizations. We think most of them could, most of them should, if they're interested in the success of their local communities. If they need to invest in their local communities, they should be investing now in journalism at a time when public support is needed. And that the large national foundations, other than the ones that have already stepped up like Knight, ought to also either get into or increase their support of journalism in a variety of ways. Our third recommendation was that public radio and television should be substantially reoriented. And that's controversial because the CPB is starting to move in this direction, but is not substantially reorienting itself to provide significant local news reporting in every community served by public stations and their websites. The vast majority of public television stations in this country do no local news, and they're not interested in it because local news does not raise money. Instead, Lawrence Welk, literally on the public television station here, we saw last night when we came back from Washington just to check on what's going on TV here, I was running Lawrence Welk special last night during fundraising week to raise money. So they're not interested in local news, they're interested in the kind of programming that's going to attract more funding in their minds. Or in many cases, they simply aren't interested in local news, they just haven't been, that hasn't been the orientation of the particular group that has that particular public license. But we believe, and it's still the vast majority of public radio stations also are not engaged in local news, more of them than television, but not as many as there should be. And we believe that they were created, in fact, explicitly, public television and radio was to provide community information, and local news is part of that information, and it should be required by the CPB, and it should be required by Congress when it reauthorizes the CPB. Universities, our fourth recommendation, universities, both public and private, as I said earlier, should become ongoing sources of local, state, and investigative reporting as part of their educational mission. You shouldn't just teach journalism, you should practice it. Universities don't just teach medicine, they practice it. Universities don't just teach law, they practice it. Universities don't just teach business, they practice it. Same thing ought to happen in journalism. And there are a number of leading journalism schools that have now moved in this direction. There are others that are resisting it because academia doesn't believe that you should be engaged in doing actual work in the subject in which you're teaching. That'll get me in trouble with somebody. Fifth, we want to create, this is the most controversial recommendation, we would like to see the creation of a national fund for local news to be created with money that the FCC now collects from, or could collect from, telecom users, television and radio broadcast licensees, and or internet service providers, which would be administered in local competition through independent state and local news councils, very much like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, or the National Science Foundation, all of which take money from the federal government, funnel it through this organization that's completely non-political and by and large resistant to political pressure. We all know that political pressures tried to be applied in some of these areas in the past, but by and large it's not corrupting them. And then, in open competition, provide money for innovations, particularly in local news coverage in news organizations across the country. Not to buy or run any local news organizations, but to be part of the mix of very diverse funding that local news organizations are going to need in the future in order to survive, and particularly in order to innovate, and in order to innovate in the ways in which they present the news and innovations in their economic models. And then lastly, something that Michael Schutzen's very interested in, that I learned a lot in working with him, is that more should be done by governments, nonprofit organizations, and journalists to increase the accessibility and usefulness of public information that is already being collected by the federal, state, and local governments, and to facilitate the gathering and dissemination of that public information by citizens. This is an interest of particularly of the Knight Commission, that also looked at the future of journalism and information in society. There's a lot of information, public information already out there. It is increasingly accessible on the internet. It needs much more attention to how you use that information to provide it for good use to citizens, and particularly through journalism. That's my
questions, folks.